A heartfelt thank you to every new member who made a first-time gift during the fall fundraising campaign. Know that you are essential to the future of independent, community-driven news. We're so happy you're here.
This is On Hand, a podcast answering your questions about the things that make Michigan unique. I'm producer Ronia Kabansug, and in last week's episode, I looked into the infamous warning sign noting a $3,000 fine for a rescue from the Sleeping Bear Dunes dune drop. This is the number 9 overlook at Pierce Stocking Scenic Drive. And it turns out this is a pretty rare occurrence for the most dire of emergencies. Most daily rescues at the park involve a helpful park ranger with a bottle of water and great coaching skills and no fine. This week on Offhand, we're talking to a listener, someone with a story of a real sleeping bear emergency.
Just a little bit of lead up. I mean, I'm a big fan of Michigan Public, and I was listening one day and mentioned your new podcast, and so I went on the web page, and there was a submission form, but in there was a question of, do you have any good stories about Sleeping Bear Dunes? And I said, oh yeah, I actually have a really good one. Hi, my name is Matt Parker, and I'm from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
If you're a fan of Michigan Public podcasts, you may recognize Matt's voice, and we'll get to that later. But for now, Matt's Sleeping Bear saga.
So the summer before my freshman year in high school, I went to a summer camp on Torch Lake called Camp Hayawenta, which has a very strong following. But because of our age group, we were allowed to take an overnight trip away from camp. And I think it was maybe 3 nights, maybe 4 at the most. And we were supervised by at least 2 camp counselors. And on the first day, we went to the 400-foot vertical.
Overlook number 9.
Overlook number 9. And everybody did the typical thing where you significantly overestimate how top heavy you are, and you start running down the dunes, and then ultimately your upper body is going faster than your lower body, and you go somersaulting, ass over tea kettle, all the way down.
And this is like a bunch of teenage boys.
Sure, and tourists and everybody else who's there. It was a perfectly sunny, blue sky summer day. And one of my buddies at the time, whom I was in Boy Scouts with for a little while, named Andy, was just in front of me, and he started somersaulting just before, I guess, I did. I went cartwheeling down past him, and then when I stopped and I looked back up, Andy sort of sat up and he said, "Man, my back is all wet." And he felt behind his head, and then he turned to me, and his entire back was covered in blood. And it was, a steady stream. I didn't realize it at the time, but he'd split his head open on a rock on the dunes. So I and someone else whom I can't remember helped him up to the top of the vertical, and we were covered in blood by the time we got to the top.
And how far down the hill were you when that happened?
At least midway.
And as a note for those who have not been to Overlook number 9 or who missed last week's episode, the parking lot is at the top of the hill. So if you go down, you have to climb up this 450-foot, 45-degree angle sandhill to get out.
So we helped him up there, and then one of us took a T-shirt off and put it on his head, and then somebody booked out of there to go call an ambulance. And then after a little while he's sort of sat there and we were trying to hold a T-shirt up to his head, an ambulance came and took him away. And then by the time we got back to camp, I can't remember if he arrived when we did or not, but when I arrived back to the cabin, he was already on his bunk. If I remember correctly, his parents were away vacationing in Europe, so they couldn't come back to get him or something, but he was lying on his bunk, and he had this enormous crescent shaved on the top of his head, and he had this crescent-shaped wound stapled with like 20 staples on the top of his head.
Do you remember what he said? Was he like, I'm never doing that again? Or was he like, that was an epic
No,
journey?
I remember asking him like how he's doing, and I figured I was really surprised to see him there, but he was like, yeah, my parents are out of the country, so like I had to come back. So he didn't seem very happy about having to come back to camp. And I asked him how he was feeling, and he just said he didn't remember much of the ambulance ride, but he remembered sort of regaining what was, like his awareness in the hospital. So he was certainly concussed, and he was sore. He said it was pretty sore. And I was looking at it and going, yeah, man, you got like, 20 metal staples holding your scalp together. So at any rate, I would guess, I have not followed up with him in many years, but I would guess he still has a significant scar under his hairline because of that.
I would bet.
So that seemed to tick the box when you guys were asking for any medical emergencies associated with Sleeping Bear Dunes. I mean, like, so that was one of them.
That hits it, I think.
Yeah. So it was not a great outing to the Sleeping Bear Dunes that time around.
Have you run down the hill since?
Yeah, in college.
You'd still run?
Well, no, I guess I was a bit more measured, maybe like kind of like a galloping lope, or like kind of a lope, down the dunes. Whereas before, I mean, like, it was like a kid in a candy store. You just go, sprinting down there, and it always ends in tears. So.
It seems like so many Michigan childhood stories from Sleeping Bear are about accidental somersaulting and a mouthful of sand. Take it from Matt, take it from his friend Andy, and take it from our rescue ranger Mike from last week.
There's about 2/3 of the way down the hill drops off a foot, and the bottom third's just a little bit steeper, so folks that are running down the hill and don't know that drop is coming can end up doing some unintentional cartwheeling, and we do see some traumatic injuries, broken bones, etc.
Don't run down the hill. Thank you to the other folks who wrote in to tell us their Sleeping Bear stories. There were some really great ones, like Tim Johnson, who wrote, "My dad took me to the dune climb at number 9 as a kid, and all of my kids have climbed it. I'm 55 and did it again this year with my 18-year-old son and 16-year-old daughter. I love that they keep this open for people to experience. I hope to climb it with my grandchildren someday." Thanks also to Lance E. Sloan, who told us about a trip he took to the dune drop with some high school friends in 1988. He wrote, "It wasn't terribly difficult, but whenever the slowest of our group, not me," he says, "needed to rest, we'd each dig a hole for ourselves and sit in it. The sand below the surface was cool, which felt really refreshing too. I don't remember all the details, but it didn't take a terribly long time to ascend the dune, and we weren't completely exhausted." Well, can't relate, Lance. I was exhausted. Join Lance and Tim and Matt in sharing your own stories with us. There's a link to the story submission form in the show notes, and that'll tell you all about what stories we're looking for next. And if you prefer to call or email, I will leave our phone number and address as well in the show notes just for you. Finally, if you're a fan of Michigan Public Podcasts, maybe you recognize Matt's voice. He recounted his story of a cross-country solo horseback ride in our series Rite of Passage. I will link that in the notes as well if you're looking for an adventure as fun and harrowing as running down the Sleeping Bear Dunes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week with a new one. Bye.